It's a pleasure to welcome Mason Porter from the University of Oxford here at UNAM. He will give an overview talk of his various research fields. And please, Mason.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So even though I'm from Los Angeles and lived 25 years there, this is my first time to Mexico. Very surprising for somebody who's from LA to have waited this long, so it's good to finally come. So I'm going to talk about cascades and social influence on networks. So this is going to be a talk more on the modeling side and about how to do some simple models of social influence and what they might be able to tell you. I've put a version, I think it's actually the same version of this talk up on SlideShare a couple weeks ago, and you can, I have my Twitter account there, and I know that I have a post there that has the talks on the slides on SlideShare. So if you're interested afterwards in looking things in more detail, then that will have like the references and so on. But anyway, you can go find it. Okay, so I'll give an introduction to these sorts of things, and then I'm going to talk about the problem of modeling social influence. Multi-stage complex contagions is a particular model that my collaborators and I have come up with. So I'll use that as a focal example. I mean, there's other examples that one can find in the literature that others have come up with. And then I will talk about a couple of more recent things very briefly, one of which is to bring ideas from what's called persistence homology. This comes from computational topology into these studies. So that one gets a little bit more technical, so I'm only going to look at just tell you briefly to show why we're doing it, and hopefully some of you will be interested in looking at the paper. And I also want to briefly talk about a model that we have for popularity cascades on Facebook. That one does not have network structure in it and is what I like to call a small data project. I have ambivalent feelings about big data. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. But there's certain ways of using data within models that you can actually help directly in the models, and that I like quite a bit. Okay, so one thing that's going to be familiar to most of you, or maybe all of you, are ordinary differential equations and partial differential equations. So an example of an ODE would be a toy model for a biological epidemic, such as a susceptible, infected, recovered model. And this is assuming that people are well mixed. So either the social connections are dense enough, or really you're assuming everybody talks to everybody else, but if they're dense enough, this can be reasonable. And this is done via a compartment model. So you've got the change in the number of susceptibles over time. This will go down because susceptibles will get infected at some rate. The infecteds in turn will come from susceptibles, people getting infected at the same rate. And there'll be some rate of decay where people will become either recovered or removed depending on how fatalistic you are. Same model though. And then you have that. Okay. So this is one of type of compartment model. So R and I and S are compartments, and you have some sort of transition between them, but you're assuming that everybody is interacting with everybody else. So homogeneously mixed, well mixed, and so on. If you want to incorporate some space, think of the Black Plague from Europe, where you had waves of disease going across the continent. You can add a diffusion term. You can add a Laplacian. So that will incorporate space in some form, but it does not incorporate social interactions. Okay, so you still have approximations of being well mixed when you add that kind of space, but you have some spatial effects. Okay, so let's just say we want to think about putting a disease model or a model for social influence on an actual social network. So you have a network structure of who talks to whom, and that is going to affect how any sort of disease or idea can propagate. So the people are what are called nodes or vertices, if you prefer, and the social connections between them are ties or edges or links, depending on what language you like to use. And so this is going to have an effect on any dynamical process that you put on top of it. So not just epidemics, not just social influence, but also oscillators, or voter models, or anything else you put on top of it. And so one of the basic questions, and the question that this talk is an example of, is how does this kind of non-trivial connectivity affect some dynamics on top of it? Does it slow down spreading? Does it speed up spreading? Or when does it slow it down or speed it up? Does it affect whether you have an epidemic? Does it affect who adopts a certain contagion, who adopts a certain idea, and so on? There's also a vice versa, because more generally you actually have a dynamical process, but the network itself is also changing. So if somebody is sick, hopefully they will stay home, and that will affect the network structure, right? So the dynamics of the network affects the dynamics on the networks and vice versa. Now, in this particular talk, I'm going to assume the network is static, and so there's an assumption involved, and what you do is you look at the relative timescales. So if the timescale of the dynamical process is much faster than the network, then maybe it's reasonable to take the network as constant to leading order and look at how the process changes. If the dynamics of the network itself is faster than the dynamics of the process, maybe you can freeze the state of the nodes and look at the network changing. And then the most generic case is when these timescales are sufficiently comparable that you really have to consider them both. Right, that's the most generic one. Okay, so I have a tutorial article, which is, well, we have our referee report, so we have to make some changes. And if you look at this and have any comments, please send them to me so that I can think about those as well as we change them. And so this is essentially just, it's a tutorial to dynamical systems on networks, mostly in the case of static networks, but a little bit in the case of networks changing, and that tries to lay out you know, how we think one would do things. And it has some pointers to the field and so on, some example calculations. And as mentioned, if you have comments on it, I'd appreciate getting them. Okay, so let's talk about cascades per se. I'm going to have to kind of tell you what a cascade is. The kind of idea of a cascade is that you start with maybe people adopted something. They adopted something and they turned from state 0 to state 1. And by virtue of some people having adopted something or becoming diseased, that will affect the probability that others also adopted or get sick. And so this can actually have a domino effect. So a cascade is referring to a domino effect of some dynamics on a network. And you can define it in various ways, whether you want to say a certain fraction adopt or enough people adopt in a certain time scale. But the idea is that some adoption activity influences more adoption activity to occur. Okay, so why should we bother? So I'm a mathematician, and my motivation is that these things are very interesting to study, and that they give you tractable examples of how network structure can affect dynamics. So that's my main reason for doing it, but there is also a very important connection to the real world. So there are practical reasons to do this, even though this is sort of where my heart is. Okay, so I don't know if you guys know who Rick Durrett is. He's a mathematician. He likes to say that the real world is a nice place to visit. So I've stolen his quote. And then there's another issue of complex contagions versus simple contagions. It's a couple of pieces of terminology that are in the literature. What I mean basically by a simple contagion, like a toy model of a biological epidemic would usually be modeled as a simple contagion. You have some person who's sick and there's a direct transmission from that person to some other person to get sick. So you can actually say identify the edge perhaps over which this transmission occurred. A complex contagion, which is a terminology that Damon Centola and Michael Macy invented for social contagions, cannot be approximated even in toy form that way, right? If I adopt something, if I buy some new product, the chance of my being able to say, okay, it's this one other specific person who influenced me. I mean, that's not what happens, right? Lots of my friends influence me, and I see things on the news and so on. So you get what's called social reinforcement, right? Several people tell me, okay, this product is really good, and then eventually maybe I buy it. And so there's a fundamental difference in modeling biological epidemics and social epidemics or social ideas, because in one case, in simplified form, okay, maybe you can identify an edge where it's been transported. In the other case, even the most simple example, you can't do it. Okay, so that's what I view as a difference. As far as I can tell, the terminology of complex contagion comes from the 2007 paper of Centola and Macy. Okay, so one thing you would do in social contagions is you might study social influence. You might have mass movements. So some people might start, like in the Arab Spring, some people might start with some of their tweets, and that might lead to something much bigger. You can have memes on social media like Facebook and Twitter, right? There was a meme to say, okay, what are these 10 books from my childhood that I remember, and various other memes, and some of these spread very far and some of them don't spread very far. So one of the types of questions that people try to answer is that given that I see some meme, which ones are going to spread very far, right? How far are they going to spread? How long are they going to last? Because, people who do marketing want to know which things will go viral, right? So if we could come up with a way to predict what goes viral, and I'm not going to do that, I have no idea how to do that, but this is somehow one of the goals that's there. You can also talk about population or adoption of Facebook applications, and this is actually considering Facebook from 2007, which is their Cambrian era, and there are these specific applications like pirates versus ninjas that were popular at the time. So there's some data from that, and so I'll come back to this later because we've subsequently done some modeling using some of that old data. And then, of course, biological epidemics. So this picture over here comes from a 2010 paper in Science by Damon Centola, and there's something he did that was really, really cool. And the reason I think it's cool is actually different from the reason most others do, but what he did is the following. He designed a social experiment using some online tools, so people getting sort of medical advice. And he engineered the social network, what I like to call an in vitro social network, indicating who could see who else's advice. So and then he examined the influence on there about whether people adopted things that their neighbors adopted and how long it did so. So these plots are sort of saying how often people adopted as a function of time, as a function of days, and these are showing the network connections that he established. Okay, so the adoption dynamics is just whatever people are doing. So it's some complicated dynamics as opposed to a simple model, and I'll show you a couple examples of these simple models. But the network itself is much more simplistic than a real social network, than an in vivo social network, such that you can imagine actually doing some mathematics with a social network with that exact connectivity. So the idea is that by putting an in vitro social network, he brings social science into more of a relation like you have with mathematics and physics, because they have the same network that I might study in a simplified case, as opposed to some real social network which is much more complicated. So that's the reason that I think his work is cool. Unfortunately, of course, it does involve a lot of funding to set those things up, so it's not like you can just go in the lab and automatically do that, but it's nice. Okay, so let's suppose you want to model social influence. So what challenges are involved? So suppose there's something that looks like a social contagion. There's a famous series of papers by Fowler and Christakis, the first of which talked about the spread of obesity over a large social network. So the type of observation you have is the following. I have a bunch of different people in a social network, and I have a time series for each person. And I then have, in the individual time series, so if I'm measuring obesity, you could measure it with what's called a body mass index, which is a type of scalar. So I would have this scalar as a function of time for each of the people in my social network, and if people are getting more obese as a function of time, I would see this number increasing, right? So I have time streams for every person, and I see these numbers increasing, and it looks like perhaps, if some people are getting fatter, maybe some of their neighbors are as well. So you wonder if there is an epidemic. Okay, so I'm given this time series. Is there an epidemic? Well, generically, there's at least 3 different things that can occur, and unless you do some other analysis, you cannot separate them. There's a paper by Thomas and Shalizi about this. So one of them is that you could really have social influence, right? Maybe people really are changing their behavior in response to what their friends on the network are doing. Spread of obesity, spread of smoking, spread of whatever. There's something similar called social learning, because there's a difference between adopting a behavior that I already know and learning about a behavior for the first time. Okay, for the obesity example, those two will sort of collapse onto the same thing, but both of these are network mechanisms, even though sociologically they're not quite the same, or they're not the same. Another thing that can occur is homophily, and I'm using this word in a very general sense here. The way I'm using the word here is to mean common internal similarities, so which is not the most specific meaning that a sociologist might use sometimes. And the idea is that these agents, these people, are doing the same thing. They're becoming obese, but they happen to be becoming obese at different times, but it's because of an intrinsic similarity. So one that might actually be a sort of homophily would be because perhaps they like fast food. Another might be that they have a genetic predisposition to it. The genetic predisposition is not a social type of homophily, but the point is they could be inherently similar in some way, but they could be showing the behavior at different times. And that can give you the same time series that number 1 can give you. The third possibility is an environment. So if more McDonald's opened up nearby, more people will eat at it, and maybe that will influence people becoming more obese. So it's a common external situation. Or in the case of like the London riots, maybe people are angry for the same reason, right? It's not necessarily influence, so it's something that's the same. And so some common external influence, but they happen to be showing behavior at different times. So again, you could get the same time series. Okay, so if I were going to try to control one of these things, saying, okay, I don't want people to become obese, or I don't want people in London to riot, or any of those things, how I try to stop this occurring will depend on whether it's 1, 2, 3, or a combination of them. Okay, you expect it to be a combination, but maybe it's 50% one, or maybe it's 100% one, who knows? Okay, so, if people are all angry for the same reason and are rioting, stopping the communication channels is not stopping the mechanism, right? Because the anger is coming separate from the communication channels. Okay. So anyway, so that's the sort of generic problem, and the way that I'm going to take a look at this is vastly simplified. I'm a mathematician, I will vastly simplify it, and I'm going to look at some simple forward models, and the nice thing about doing that, besides analytical tractability, is that I can just say, here are the mechanisms that are present in this model. I am going to impose those mechanisms, and I can just say, what can I observe if I know, so I know what the mechanism is in my case, and I can just say, here are the observations that I have based on those mechanisms. So what's the simplest type of model that can lead to certain types of outcomes? And ultimately what you want to do is combine it with parameters estimated from real data, which is something that people are starting to do, but needs to go further. Okay, so efforts to do these simple models date back 40 years. So there's a set of models by de Groot, set of models by Noah Friedkin. The type of models I'll show you, which are called threshold models, actually originated with Mark Granovetter. And for those of you who know some of Mark Granovetter's work, it's a paper other than his strength of weak ties paper. It's a different one of his. Everyone likes to cite the other one. Okay. The Onion has, I don't know if you've heard of The Onion, but The Onion has a theory about the obesity epidemic where they traced it to one very large person on the Mayflower. I'm not sure how you would go and validate this, but this article came out like the day before I gave one of these talks 6 months ago, and I'm like, okay, I'm using this slide in this talk forever. Okay, so how can we gain insights? All right, so the most common thing that people do, so the social scientists and the statisticians, and I think there's quite a few computer scientists involved in this as well, do well-controlled experiments and careful data analysis and statistics, right? So if people who are doing data analysis on Twitter data are usually taking this first type of approach. And then the type of approach that I want to advocate as a complement, it's certainly not a replacement, but I think it's a very good complement, is to look at some simple models that are mathematically tractable, and so that I can try to understand very deeply what's going on in those particular models. And then, again, in general, what you want to do is that you want to have some of this to estimate, some of the first one, I think I'm losing the pointer here, some of the first one to estimate parameters like what you would do with a basic reproductive number in disease models, and then take those parameters, hopefully there won't be a large number of them, and I'll give you an example in, I think, one slide of what those parameters might be. So try to estimate them, and then have the simple models but with the parameters from real data, and then see how well you can do even with a simplistic model. And so ultimately that's the type of thing that I think is a very good way of doing it, and then you can always decide, all right, are there any situations in which these ultra simple models are ever good, or do you fundamentally have to make certain generalizations and so on? Okay, so here is one example of a simple model. It's called the Watts threshold model. So it was published in PNAS 12 years ago. It is a modification of a model that Granovetter did, but without network structure in 1978. So I've got some social network. It's a static network in the original, it's a static network in the original model. Each node has some threshold, R sub j, so the j indexes the nodes, drawn from some distribution. So the two most common that are studied are uniform or Gaussian. So when I was talking about parameters being estimated from real data, I'm thinking about these guys, okay? Those are the types of things that I would want to estimate from some observations, if possible. And so in this case, drawn from some distribution can be one of two states, 0 or 1. So 0 means has not adopted, or is healthy, or is uninfected, or whatnot. 1 means has adopted, so 0 can also mean passive. So 1 is active, or infected, or adopted, or what have you. I choose some fraction of nodes, so maybe uniformly at random, or maybe I only choose one node, and I say that those nodes are active. Those nodes are early adopters, they have 1, and then ultimately that's different in different realizations, so you would average over different realizations of doing that. So maybe node number 1 is active in the first one you try, or node number 2 is active in the second, and I'll show a plot to illustrate that a little bit. Now, on the technical side, which I don't focus on in the talk, but I want to bring this up because if you actually simulate this, you need to think about it. You can essentially think about either continuous or discrete dynamics. In discrete dynamics, you update everybody at the same time, so it's called synchronous updating. And so I have some update rule that I have not yet explained, and I consider in every discrete time step every node, and I update it according to whatever rule that is. There's also asynchronous updating, which amounts to an attempt at continuous time, but with an infinitesimal time step. The idea is that so this would be used, a mathematician would call it a Gillespie algorithm, a physicist would call it a kinetic Monte Carlo algorithm. You pick some node by some random process, and in this infinitesimal time step, I will consider the update only of that node. So as t goes to infinity, for many models, these will give you the same thing, but the amount of time it will take is different, and the finite time dynamics can be different. So sometimes you really do have to care about which of those. Okay, so what's the update rule in this particular case? And then there's other models that differ just by having different update rules. I look at my threshold, so I'm node j, I look at my threshold. I look at how many of my neighbors are infected. So m is the number of my neighbors who are in this state 1 who've bought an iPad or whatever. I divide it by my degree. Okay, so I don't have to do it that way, so I'm thinking of what fraction of my neighbors have bought an iPad. And then if this fraction is at least as large as my threshold, which is some sort of resistance for having doing it, then I will deterministically buy an iPad. All right, so you immediately see I've made huge numbers of simplifications from reality. For one thing, I only have 2 states. For another, if I go from state 0 to state 1, in this model, I can never go back. So you should imagine that if I have any experiment in which people eventually change back, that is beyond the time scale that I'm exploring, right? So if people change their Facebook profile, maybe I'm looking at the first change, but if they change back, that's after what I view as t goes to infinity in this kind of model. And then, okay, so this thing right here, this m over kj, the reason I have that there is that I'm trying to not give extra credit to nodes which have high degree. But there are some models in which which maybe a node with a high degree is more likely to adopt. So if I'm thinking about a Facebook feed, maybe I'm thinking about the number of times it shows up on my feed, and so then it would be the number of neighbors, not the fraction. So it's a modeling choice to take m over kj versus to take just m. And again, it depends on what you're studying, and you can obviously make this much more complicated if you want. There's going to be a general formula for a wide class of update rules where things will work, and so there is room there for growth even within the confines of the mathematics. So an important assumption that I make, so it's unrealistic, but it actually specifically helps certain mathematical approximations, is this monotonicity. If I go from 0 to 1, in this mechanism have no way to go back, and that does allow certain types of mathematical analyses, in particular branching processes, to work. But this is made for simplicity and for mathematics, and so the types of generalizations to think about to make things more realistic is also to relax that. There are some models that relax it. Okay, this is a rewriting of the same mechanism as before in other language. So I'm stealing a slide from my former postdoc, Sergei Melnik. His slides tend to have less fancy fonts and fewer colors than mine. But he was the first author on the multi-stage complex contagion behaviors multi-stage complex contagion paper. So a bunch of the slides come from him. Okay, so you can write things in the form of a response function. So this is this f, and this response function is exactly encapsulating the update rule that I gave you in mostly words on the last slide. I'm also going to label a couple sets because it will be convenient for later. I'm going to label inactive neighbors, inactive people as in a set S0. These are people who do not influence their neighbors. And I'm going to label active people in the set S1, and these are people who do influence their neighbors. And the reason that I'm introducing these terms is that the multi-stage complex contagion generalization is because I will have an S2. Okay, so that's why it became useful to have those. And so this particular response function, so that I can write things in the form of a probability, or really a response, is the same as before. So I'm either exceeding the threshold, which is defined in that way, or I'm not. And so that will end up being part of a calculation within figuring out the probabilities in a branching process calculation. Okay, so one thing I mentioned earlier had to do with different initial conditions. When I do a simulation, I am going to need to average over different realizations. In this case, my update rule is deterministic, right? So for certain things like the biological epidemics, you have probabilistic update rules, so you would have to average over different realizations of those. In my case, if I fix the graph and I fix the initial conditions, then after that, everything will be deterministic for this particular model. So when I talk about ensembles and averaging, if I have a random graph model, I will need to average over both the graph and the initial conditions. If I have a static graph, I will need to average over the initial conditions. And then that is something that will be compared to the analytical calculation. Okay, so different initial conditions give different results. So I have a very simple graph here, and I'm going to look at the time goes to infinity adoption of certain of this. So how many nodes have the state 1 in the limit as time goes to infinity. So if I start this center node as active, and I have a threshold of 0.3 for each node, so that at least if 30% of its neighbors are active, it becomes active. Okay, so what will happen is that I have this node here, and then the next step, the ones next to it will become active, and so on, and as t goes to infinity, eventually all of them become active. However, if I start over here, I'm never able to activate that node, and once I know the first time that I cannot activate that node, I know that I'm never able to do it, in this particular case, because no reds come from anywhere else, and so I'm stuck with only getting 5 nodes that are activated, 5 out of the 16. And then over here, I only get 2 of the nodes activated. So when I'm comparing a fraction of active neighbors, what I would do is average over an ensemble with the different people who started this rumor, or who adopted the iPad, to compare to a branching process. Okay. So just to remind you, this is a schematic now of the model, and it's showing again the same model as before. I can either be below threshold in the set S0. I can be above the threshold in the set S1. S0 and S1 are disjoint. But if I'm barely above the threshold versus strongly above the threshold, I'm exerting the same amount of influence on my neighbors. Okay, so the next slide is what's going to have the generalization for that. What we want are 3 stages. So in this case, if I am very strongly above the threshold, in particular, we're going to establish a second threshold. So if I'm above the second threshold, I exert some amount of influence on my neighbors. So think of these as the leaders of some movement. But if I'm only above the first threshold, I exert less influence on my neighbors. Think of these as the followers of the movement. So S0 and S1 are disjoint. S2 is a subset of S1, the way we have formulated this. Okay, and you don't have to formulate it that way, but we found it convenient. So this is the model with the update rules that I'll show you that was in this paper that came out last year, and that I'll spend some time going through some parts of. Okay, and just to make sure you remember this generalization, I'm going to show you some famous movie characters, movie and TV characters. So the passive nodes are like the dude, who ironically are not exerting any influence. The active nodes, who are in state S1, are like Jean-Luc Picard, who are exerting influence. And yes, we do use this word in the paper, the hyperactive nodes, S2, are like Dark Helmet. We called it hyperactive so I could make Spaceballs jokes in talks, are exerting even more influence on their neighbors. Okay, and remember, S2 is a subset of S1, but S1 is disjoint from S0. All right. So we think of this as a peer pressure. How much is some node experiencing from its neighbors? But it experiences larger peer pressure from these hyperactive neighbors. So I have M1, which is the number of neighbors who are in the set S1, the number of active neighbors, plus some bonus beta times M2, who are the number of excuse me, the number of neighbors that are in S2. So if a neighbor is in S2, that means that the influence exerted is M1 plus beta M2, and then divided by K, I'm dividing by the number of neighbors I have. But the S2 being a subset of S1 is why this is written as M1 plus beta M2. So it was convenient for writing down the update rule as far as formulating it that way. So betas are bonus influence. If it's 0, you reduce to the previous model, and the higher it is, the more extra peer pressure is exerted by the hyperactive neighbors. And then the update rule works just as before. So instead of having the fraction, I just have in general this peer pressure. So if you wanted to generalize this further, you would just have a different function here. And if there's 2 thresholds, there's a lower threshold and a higher threshold. So I want the second threshold to be at least as large as the first for this to make sense. And if I'm at least as large as a certain threshold, I will go into that state. Okay? Well, beta is just a parameter we invented. So the lowest part is 0, or else the whole formulation doesn't make sense. The examples that we considered tended to have more beta less than 1. But the way I wrote this doesn't actually have that assumption. Yeah. So this is written in this, writing it as a linear combination is exactly because we formulated the sets that way. But that was a choice that we made for our own convenience, and is not a choice that you would have to make. Okay, so in particular, because we formulated it this way, the model does allow a node to go directly from S0 to S2. Okay, so that can occur. In practice, we have not observed that very often in simulations, but there's nothing that prevents it. And then you can write down the response function and so on. Okay. So I want to now show you what this model can do in comparison to the other. So there's a series of numerical experiments that are in the paper, and then there's some analytics, so I'll go over some of these. And then eventually I'll start going a little bit faster just to show you some hints of some more recent things. The network in question that we use, I have some old Facebook data from 2005. This is the pre-Cambrian era from Facebook in contrast to the Cambrian era of 2007. And I have 100 different universities, and so you can imagine this as the type of network on which some influence really would spread. So for example, I have one from the University of Oklahoma, which has 18,000 nodes. It's a very highly clustered network because social networks tend to be that way. And so if we insert these thresholds and we put, say, 2% of the nodes initially active, which is a decently large amount actually, then you get the following. So the horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is the fraction of people in state 1 in the node, in the network. And we're keeping track of what state people are in. Remember, this purple is strongly above threshold. It's just we're pretending they're strongly above threshold. In this case, would mean larger than 0.3. But in the left, we're not giving them bonus influence, and in the right, we are. And so what happens in the left is that you don't get a cascade. You don't get very many people adopting, and in the right, you are. Okay, so this model that we have was constructed to do this, right? So this is just illustrating something that we built the model to do. And okay, so we had to add a decent number of influence to do this. Okay, somewhat less obvious, but it makes sense after you think about it. But in this case, we did not actually build the model to be able to do it, is an S1 cascade can facilitate an S2 cascade. So by having more sheep, it is possible, in this model at least, to get a cascade of leaders. I cannot come up with something from, I don't have an example from like real life where people have illustrated this as the mechanism that it's occurred. So maybe eventually I'll be able to, someone who knows something from history to give me an example. But the point is, I can get more cascades by adding sheep. And the way this works is that imagine I take my first threshold. If they're both the same, I only have 2 states in total rather than 3 by definition. I lower the first threshold so I make it easier to become a sheep. And therefore, I can get a cascade that way. So I'm purposely saying facilitates, not causes, because this is not actually giving a causal relation. It's just saying by having a lower threshold, I can get a cascade, which makes sense after you think about it, but was not something that we constructed the model in advance to do, like the previous example. Okay, so we have some things that can occur, and now it's going to get a bit more abstract. We use a certain random graph model, and I'll define it for you, that allows us to have a lot of control over when certain nodes change their state. And so these graph models are not realistic social networks, but they were very convenient to develop a more precise understanding. Okay, so we call these Z1, Z2 regular random graphs. It's a generalization of Z regular random graphs, which says that every node has the same degree, and otherwise I connect them up uniformly at random. I consider one edge of a node, and I randomly connect to another edge of a node, and I repeat until everything is completely connected. Okay. In this case, I have 2 types of pieces. I have pieces with degree Z1 and pieces with degree Z2. And then sometimes, or I will specify also the relative fraction of each. So I might specify that there's 1/3 Z1 and 2/3 Z2, or in this case, half Z1 and half Z2. And in some models, I will specify how often they're connected to each other in a joint distribution. In some models, I will not. So if I fix the degree distribution and just say I have this, so fixing the degree distribution will amount to fixing the fraction of nodes of each type, or of nodes of each type, but not fixing how often they're connected to nodes of their own type or nodes of other types. If I fix a joint distribution, I'm also going to say, okay, for example, maybe in this case, I have nodes of degree 4. On average, 3 of the edges connect to nodes of degree 4, and 1 of them connects to nodes of degree 24. And in the case of the degree 24, on average, 23 of those connect to nodes of degree 24, and 1 of those connects to nodes of degree 4. Right? So if I only take P of K, I get a special case of what's called the configuration model. And if I take this other one, I get a special case of a generalization of the configuration model. Okay, so let's take this 4 and 24 example, and the reason I'm doing this is that if I take this 4 and this 24, and with these specific thresholds, I know exactly how many neighbors, how many active neighbors and hyperactive neighbors a degree 4 node needs in order to advance, and I know exactly how many of those neighbors a degree 24 node needs in order to advance. So this random graph makes it much easier to get a handle on things because I know in advance the conditions that allow a node to advance because I've controlled them. Okay. So what do you get in a certain example? So again, it's going to be, these are the same sets of simulations, but in one case I have beta equals 0, and the other case I have beta equals 0.45. So I'm averaging over the same 100 realizations of the random graph and the same 100 initial conditions, but one case I have no bonus, in one case I do. This is the fraction of nodes which are in state 1, well, in state 1 and in state 2. On the vertical axis, although state 2 does not exist on the top, and it's time on the horizontal axis. So if I only just look at the network as a whole, I get, okay, half of the nodes, eventually become active. But then, because I know exactly what types of nodes they are, what you end up actually finding is that all of the degree 4 nodes become active, and none of the degree 24 nodes become active. Okay? So you can separate what different types of nodes are doing in this simplified case. And then on the bottom, I give this bonus influence. I mean, the 0.45 was just chosen so we can illustrate these dynamics, not because it has any special meaning. And what happens is that first, the degree 4 nodes go into state 1. Then enough of those go into state 1 that eventually some start going into state 2. And so a bunch of those go into state 2. So at that point, you're over here, right, with your overall S1. And then what will happen is that because this is chosen randomly, there'll be some degree 24 nodes that even though on average they only have 1 degree 4 neighbor, some of them will say have a couple of degree 4 neighbors, and so those will start to change. And once those change, the whole dominoes fall. Okay, right? So the idea is that because we chose this random graph model, basically we know exactly what happens. Okay, that was numerics. You can actually get those curves like that analytically, and they do, for that kind of model, they'll do very well. We're going to consider the case where we fix P of K, so we know the relative fraction of degree 4 and 24 neighbors, but we don't know who they're connected to other than uniformly at random, and you can get analytical expressions for the time dependence of how many nodes there are in state S1 and how many there are in state S2, right? So it's a time-dependent calculation. It uses some assumptions. So mean field theory is a type of theory that gets used when you write down an ODE model, but in this case we're actually deriving a mean field theory, saying there's enough connectivity that the average connectivity will be enough in some cases, rather than keeping track of the changes of every single node. Locally tree-like, so these are papers that go into the more technical things of what those assumptions mean. Locally tree-like means I have a sequence of graphs, so I get the number of nodes going to infinity, and as I take that sequence of graphs with those nodes going to infinity, all the measure of loops will go to 0 in that limit, but of all loops, so of triangles and squares and so on. So for a real network, I won't ever really be able to check that condition, but you can calculate quantities like clustering coefficients that measure how many fractions of triangles are closed. And so if you have a real network with a small clustering coefficient, then the hope is that that should be close enough to what the actual hypotheses are that this kind of calculation should work. At least that's the hope. It's much more subtle than that. It's much more subtle than that, both on when it works and when it does not work. Okay, so what does the basic analytical approach do? And I'll show you some of the equations. I'm not going to go in too much detail because this is the type of thing that you should really, go home and think about it if you want to really learn that. It's a generalization of these single stage, so the Watts type model, to 2 stages. So my colleague James Gleason has several good papers that have nice presentations of it, like this one from 2008. So some advantages. One is that it's intuitive. 2 is that you can generalize it to several other processes. I wrote down a response function f, and so basically if you take a response function f that satisfies certain conditions, any function that does that, and there's a decent number, a lot of percolation problems that people study will satisfy it, some of the simple biological epidemic problems people study will satisfy it, and the actual analytical formula just has the generic function in there, and so you can plug that in to use it for many processes beyond what we do. Okay, so what are the limitations? So one is that this version of it, as I said, there's some generalizations, works for monotonic dynamics only, which is a very severe limitation when it comes to real social influence. The other is that it's only giving an expected active fraction rather than the whole distribution. So I take my numerical simulations, I average over the ensemble, and I compare that average to what the theory is giving me, right? So I'm not getting the distribution of what might happen. And for some things, right, in real life, when you don't really have those averages in most situations. You know, something went viral or it didn't, you have an instance. So that's also a limitation. Okay, and then I'm going to explain this using the single stage one as an example, and I'll show you the spot in the process where this locally tree-like type of assumption gets used. Okay, so the idea is the following. I have some focal node. Say it's this one. The node either started as active or it had a chance of becoming active. If it became active, it had to get influenced by its children. The locally tree-like assumption is that I'm not allowing it to get influenced by its parent. So if there's too many cycles and there's too many parents that come and influence it, I'm going to get a bad approximation. Okay, so it's the fact that I can do this by levels, which is why you make that assumption. So you either start active or you did not start active, and you have just a combinatorial calculation of the ways in which you could have become active based on how likely you are to become active for a given number of neighbors active, summing over those which number of neighbors that is and the probability of those occurring, right? So this is, yeah? Well, I mean, I'm arbitrarily calling this one children. I mean, that's, I'm picking a direction because it doesn't, you normally call it children in branching processes because of how they were invented, because you're thinking of genealogical descendants, but that's completely arbitrary. But the idea, though, is that when I update this, I can only go below me, and I'm not allowing myself to go above me. So if there's too many loops that go up here, that's a way to cause it to go wrong. I could have if I wanted to, but this is following just the usual convention. Okay, so you can go through and you can turn the crank, and what happens is you get an algebraic equation, and the analytical curves that I'll show you on a couple plots are numerical solutions of algebraic equations as compared to averages over stochastic processes. I will skip the interlude, which goes through a little bit more some of those subtleties on those fields, on those approximations. So the difference between doing the multi-stage model, I now have to do this formula, I have to have it both for an S1 and S2. So it's very much like the ones in the single stage case, except the combinatorics is a more intricate calculation, right? So you have to just go and work a little bit harder to work through what the formulas are. This diagram actually, well, you probably want to stare at it for a little while, longer than I'm going to let you stare at it to get that to work. But conceptually, hopefully I've conveyed what this type of approximation does and what assumptions it needs. And then if you are interested in actually working out the specifics, this is the type of reason that I put these slides on SlideShare, right? So you can see it and go through it. Okay, so let's show some comparisons of the numerics and the theory. And then I also want to talk about a couple of these other projects that I hinted at. They'll only do those quickly. So over here I have the amount of extra influence, and here I have the equilibrium fraction of adopted neighbors. And the cool thing here, and so this is also one of these Z1, Z2 regular random graphs. The cool thing here is that the bifurcation diagrams that tell you when the dynamics change, you can actually get analytically, not just numerically. And so at least for some examples, right, it's not going to work perfectly for all examples, it balances very nicely. You can also get the time evolution for each of these states. And so so this is now in this regime over here with this particular amount of bonus, and it's in this regime because the pieces I have allow me to know exactly when each type of node advances. Okay, so then you get this in the S1 case, and in the S2 case, you get this. It works pretty nicely. You'll notice that it's a little bit off, and it turns out there's systematic reasons that it's a little bit off. So it works well, but not perfectly. And then, of course, if you use more complicated networks that don't satisfy certain assumptions, it will work less well. You can do some more complicated networks, though. You can do what's called an Erdos-Renyi graph. So this particular one should be, so in this case, it's GNP. That means that I have an independent probability P for each pair of nodes to determine whether it's connected, and we determine the probability P, and I don't remember what it was, so that the mean number of neighbors is 5 in this case. And so you get more plateaus, but again, the theory and the numerics agree very nicely. Okay, you can also use non-uniform thresholds, which are a bit more realistic, and so then instead of getting plateaus, you get smooth out steps. If you look carefully, you'll notice that there's a little bit more disagreement that occurred as a result of this, but you have to look at this particular plot carefully to see it. And then I want to tell you about a couple of the things that our theory specifically does not get. I believe I know how to generalize it to get these things, but it was more interesting for us to move on to other things. So this is more the type of exercise that I would give to a graduate student, so to help them learn these types of methods in the first place, because it's sort of at the level of a technical exercise relative to what we've done. The cool thing is there is some systematic stuff involved. So one of them is a toy version of what's sometimes called the Junebug Effect. So this is a famous incident that occurred in June. Of, I don't know, the 40s or 30s. There's an entire book called The Junebug. And it was some factory in a northeastern state, maybe in New Jersey, and there's this guy who in June was complaining about being sick. And pretty soon, his friends started complaining about being sick because they thought they were sick. And then eventually, he believed his own rumor and really thought he was sick instead of just pretending. So, okay, so the precise thing in the context of the model is the following. So it is believing one's own gossip is a bit of a more precise way of what's going on in the model than saying Junebug, but it's a toy version of this. So we have an S1 active node J. It influences its neighboring nodes at S0 to become S1 active. So for those of you who follow baseball, you should think of Tommy Lasorda building himself up into fury. It influences the neighbors to become S1 active, and so those guys are S1 active, which influences the first person to become S2 active, believing his own rumor by going from S1 to S2 as a result of the neighbors. Okay, this is an example of what's called a dynamical correlation. I actually skipped that part of the talk. There's two types of correlations. There's structural and dynamical. A structural correlation would be along the lines of how often are degree 5 nodes connected to degree 4 nodes. If I specify the joint probability, that's an example of a structural correlation. A dynamical correlation says, when I update nodes, I cannot just consider them one at a time, but I might have to consider the neighbor of my node when I choose whether I'm going to be updated. So that's an example of a dynamical correlation. So what ends up happening is if I go to t goes to infinity, I get the exactly correct final fraction of S2 nodes, but the theory will underestimate them in the temporal dynamics because of essentially exactly this. Okay, there's another one, which in the paper we called state segregation before we came up with a better name. So you hang up first, no, you hang up first. So you should think of Anakin and Padme in Star Wars, I think 2, not being able to go apart or something like that. So you adopt first, no, you adopt first. So a node J has a sufficiently high threshold such that to become S2 active, it needs all its neighbors, for example, to be S1 active. However, one of those neighbors needs this node J to become S2 active for it itself to advance. So the two are sort of stuck to each other, waiting to see which domino will fall first. But as soon as one domino falls, the other one will also fall. That's why it's a you hang up first, no, you hang up first. And so this ends up overestimating the observed fraction, although again it gets to t goes to infinity right. So basically what happens is that the cascade goes around the rest of the network, goes around a much longer loop. And so eventually one of those two adopts and then the other adopts. Right? So these are sort of the two of the systematic reasons why you observe some of the inaccuracies in some of the plots I showed, and that you would observe larger inaccuracies in situations where you have more clustering or other things where the hypotheses are not satisfied. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a bit and just give you a couple hints, and then I know we started a little bit late, so I'll go a few more minutes, but I won't go too much longer. So I'll give you a couple hints. So one thing is that I've been talking to these people who do persistence homology. So we've got a paper currently under review. I don't have our referee reports yet, so we don't know the damage yet, but it's being reviewed by a fancy journal. And we're using some ideas from computational topology. And those things have a couple of very cool things that are there. And this was my excuse to learn some more of those topics. One cool thing that these methods are good for is that they go beyond pairwise relations. Most of the studies of networks, because of the types of tools that are available, tend to focus on pairwise relations, right? An edge is a pairwise relation between a pair of nodes. But some of the things that I already talked about, that I hinted at earlier, needed higher order relations, maybe 3 cycles or 4 cycles. But you can only, in standard network science, you only do those as sequences of pairs. Topological methods allow you to consider more than 2 nodes at once. They're very natural for that. So that's one of the cool reasons of doing it. And in particular, homology, which is the study of holes, has discrete analogs and can be made very powerful computationally, not just theoretically, and so that becomes a convenient tool to do it. When do 1 cycles get born? When do other more complicated types of cycles get born? One of the hypotheses that is needed for those types of things is constructing something that's called a filtration, is monotonic dynamics. So we already have one of the hypotheses, the main one that we would need to use that technology. So you can use that technology, you can filter according to the dynamics, which is a very unusual way of filtering from the perspective of the computational topologists. I think that's something I can bring up again at the end if anyone wants to know more about that. But it's an unusual way of filtering. And what you can do is that you can take different trajectories. You map them into what's called a barcode space. You have a proper distance in barcode space, so you can now map back and talk about distances between different trajectories. I come from dynamical systems, and dynamical systems is built for t goes to infinity calculations. So this gives at least some hope of getting how different trajectories, how different some trajectories are without going all the way to t goes to infinity. Okay, so I've told you all this good stuff. Why do I not just, solve everything now? The computational scaling is horrible. Like, imagine how horrible the worst one you know is, and make it worse. Computational scaling is horrible, so you have to make all sorts of approximations or use small networks, and you don't want to have finite size effects, and you don't want to make approximations that end up giving you results that are artifacts of algorithms. So computationally, there's a lot of work to do, and we ended up designing a project that we could do a couple specific things. And the specific thing that we did is that I'm going to go back to the Black Plague. And when you have diseases, a bunch of diseases will actually skip some countries, right? Why do they skip some countries? Even the countries that are maybe more nearby, right? They will skip some countries. So there's actually a couple different things that can occur. You can either have, via a social network, the appearance of a new cluster of contagions, or if you have some underlying backbone, you can have a wavefront along that. And so you actually have a mixture. And so the thing that we studied with this was, when do you have some sort of contagion, in this case a social contagion, going along a backbone, which we put in an underlying geometry in the network. Think of a road network like in the city of London. And when do you have new clusters occurring? Think of shortcuts that would come from metro stations, right? So both of these things occur. And it's not just that you never have wavefront propagation before, but now we're saying, when do you have really a diffusion process along some underlying space, and when do you have jumps, right? So it's going back a little bit to the original. You really have mixtures of both. When new freshmen come to Oxford in October, they go and they sit in the dining hall, and the dining hall sits 200 people very close to each other. The disease is diffusing when you're in the dining hall because you really do have all-to-all connectivity, right? But you have other times when it's not. Okay, so I hope I've tantalized you enough that you'll look at that paper, but you can look at things with geometry and topology and dimensionality. You end up, by accident, getting a different form of nonlinear dimension reduction than what people had been doing. So lots of cool things. We have it's like a 6 or 7 page paper with a 50-page supplement, but maybe you'll be interested to look at least at the 6 or 7 page paper. The other one that I want to bring up, again, I'll go kind of quickly just because we're towards the end, is popularity cascades on Facebook. And this was actually why I brought up that particular example, because we used their data. We worked with those 2 authors to do this. One is at Oxford, one used to be at Oxford. And this particular study does not actually have network structure. The type of information we have, it's over 2 months, and it's once an hour, and every hour we have the rank order, but also the number of applications. How many people have Pirates and Ninjas in total? How many people have what's it called? One of the Texas Hold'em Poker in total. All these very highbrow applications that used to dominate Facebook. And so what we do is we have a generative model, and the generative model says there's 2 mechanisms. So we're not promising that other mechanisms can't occur. You either look at the list of top applications and you have some chance of adopting an application from this list, or you look at your feed and you adopt something from one of your friends, and within looking at your feed, you also have a parameter that says, how far back do you go? Do I look back 1 hour? Do I look back 2 hours? And so on. So if you do this, and if you take these mechanisms, you have a couple parameters. If you look at the long time behavior, and you compare the qualitative dynamics with any choice of these parameters, I guess I don't have that plot, or I have a couple examples. I have a couple examples of that plot of two versions of it, two choices of parameters. If you compare the long time behavior, you get the same qualitative results for all of these. It's not quite the same quantitatively, but the same qualitative results, right? This blue and this purple have completely different values of the parameters, but if I take long time, I get the same thing. If, however, I incorporate, we do training on the data for the first couple of days, so we're only predicting after the first couple of days. So basically, when there's a bit of a steady-ish state, there's a transient when applications are first introduced that we're not modeling but we're incorporating. You get completely different behavior in the time dependence, but the same behavior in the long time. This part is a cartoon of the mechanism. Okay, so why is that important? And so this is an example of actually using some data. It's a small data project, using some data in a simple model, but using it in a way to really make the model go farther. A lot of people, some of you have heard me name their names before. I will not name their names while we're recording. But a lot of people will study various models and they'll say, okay, I'm going to look at this as t goes to infinity, and I find a power law, and this mechanism gave me a power law or gave me something else, and therefore I'm going to now somehow say that this mechanism is what's going on. Except for the fact that long time, two completely different mechanisms give you the same thing. Right? So all you can do if you do that kind of study is that you can rule out mechanisms. But I cannot promise that some other mechanism cannot give the same thing. And in particular, considering temporal dynamics and not just going to a long-time equilibrium is really important. So in particular, something here that I cannot rule out, I only considered a couple mechanisms. Well, in the supplementary information, we consider a few more. But maybe there's a mechanism that I did not consider that could also produce this, right? So I cannot promise that. I can only promise within the confines of the mechanisms I considered. But, equilibrium behavior, long-time behavior is not enough because very different mechanisms could give you the same results if you're only looking at long time. So that's what that paper with this one specific example is trying to illustrate. Facebook data from 2007 by itself is probably not the most important thing in the world, but the message about how you should model complex systems is very important. All right, so I'm going to now go to the conclusion slide, and I will stop there. So that's of course the Holy Grail, right? That's what you want to do. So I think you might have missed some of the motivational parts when I was talking exactly about that problem. So we're not at that stage. What we're able to say is I have a very specific mechanism, and it's specific enough that I can do some math, so I can say exactly what this mechanism is, but more generically what you want to do is to figure out what the mechanism is, and to say, okay, this rumor will become viral, this will not. And so a lot of people in computer science are spending a bunch of time on this, but really we're all just sort of getting small hints here and there. There's also a lot of confounding things because something that looks viral, so again, this was also part of the things before you came in, some of the things that look viral might actually not be viral because maybe it started spreading and then CNN put it up there and now all these other people spread it because it happens to be on CNN. So that's not a mechanism of virality, right? Virality is an actual network effect. So yeah, we want to do that. We're very far away from that.
Are there any other questions?
In principle, it makes sense. So there are, unsurprisingly, a lot of people who have been writing a lot of papers on Ebola lately. There's a journal called PLOS Current Diseases where people who have sort of data-driven studies are doing this. And there's actually a website of people. I think it's run from Alessandro Vespignani's group at Northeastern, and some others are involved as well, where they're trying to collect which papers are studying Ebola. In principle, one can do this. In practice, I used a very simple disease model, so you want to use a disease model that's appropriate to the disease you're studying. right? So you start adding more compartments, and you start trying to estimate parameters from data, and who knows how good those estimations are. So in principle, yes. In practice, there's a lot of work. But people are trying to do it, and because of the fact that this has been a recently very important thing, this disease in particular has gotten a lot of attention. And so there already are several papers where people who do network analysis, putting simple models on networks, are tackling it. I don't remember the website offhand, but if you Google this, you'll find it pretty quickly. And they're tabulating not only their own work, but also work by other authors, which is refreshing. And you can just see what people have been trying to do. I mean, I think it can be that the traditional modeling framework just says take a mean field and do ODEs. So the traditional modeling framework has no spatial structure at all. And then after that, you add diffusion, and we know diffusion is only a small part of the story. So this is incorporating features that we know are more realistic than what's there before. There's still a very big leap from this to saying, okay, what should my vaccination strategy be, right? I mean, but that's what exactly the people who, Vespignani and so on, have been trying to start doing. You know, so in principle, yes, but this, I'm working at a very, I want to say fundamental, but I mean, maybe that's not the right word because there are other things that are fundamental too. I'm working on a very abstract level that sort of says, I'm going to insert these mechanisms. I'm going to remove the problem of not knowing what the mechanism is, and I want to say, what are the set of behaviors I can observe from this exact mechanism and take advantage of the fact that I can solve it. If I want to then go directly to an actual disease, then you really have to estimate the parameters from real life. Because I know that if I have slightly different parameters, or if I have different parameters, I can either get a cascade or not get a cascade. So I'm drawing bifurcation diagrams saying what the limits are with this simple model, and what you want to do in real life is say, all right, if I believe one of these simple models, or some suitable perturbation thereof, you know, which regime of space am I actually in? Right? So you estimate your parameters to try to figure it out, and hopefully the regime of space is sufficiently robust that you know, so in principle, yes, but then the leap between, so Yogi Berra had a nice quote. I'm gonna quote him because this is essentially the summary of a shorter summary of my answer. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. Right? I mean, the stuff is useful. It's a good way of thinking about it, but you have to get very seriously into the real data. But you want to do it with simple models, because if you only just hit it with a large sledgehammer, then even if you get an answer that looks right from curve fitting, that answer too cannot be put into a vaccination strategy. And I think a lot of people, and this is why I get skeptical, I mean, big data is important, but it's not a panacea. And people sort of act like doing it with big data is going to solve the problem, but like, you know, they're solving a problem with ground truth that they know, and it doesn't tell you what to actually do afterwards. So I think you need the simple models to help get into the mechanisms. Yep. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I have not tried to do that one before. There are a couple studies that have temporal networks, time-dependent networks with threshold models, and there's even more studies that have time-dependent networks with the biological epidemic models. I don't know if anyone has actually tried doing it with having a time-dependent threshold. I mean, I get asked that question almost every time I give this talk. It's a worthwhile thing to do, and that is one of the relevant steps. And I don't know if there's a paper that does that one specifically. I know I've thought about it, and one of my PhD students has done some calculations with that, but the only calculations we found turned out to be, at least in the way we formulated it, slightly trivial in the sense of not actually telling us more than this was. And so that student has now, so what that student's actually now doing is having network structures that build in homophily, build in effects of edges existing because people are similar in some latent way. And so that's another thing that we don't have in this model. And so we're trying to incorporate something else in the structural level, but that's separate from incorporating things changing. I mean, there's a lot of things we ignore and we try to add one of them at a time, and that's one of the ones that's very much worth adding. I saw hands. Okay. Yeah. So I can. Yeah. So I'll try to. I have a lot of opinions on that. I will try to give a small. A small number. So network science. So to me, network science is sort of, this is the study of connectivity for its own sake, right? If I want to encapsulate what it actually is, and the study of networks vastly predates so-called network science, right? Graph theorists did things for a long while. People in social networks and computer networks and engineering did things for a long while. And somehow, partly because of efforts from physics, and I think to the secondary extent from computer science, people have conglomerated more into a separate field. Successes and failures, I think my opinion on what's past success and past failures are a bit different from others. There's a lot of very nice, simple models that you can do a lot of math on that are very interesting. That's one of the successes, and you can you do various things with them, and they've been adapted to be more complicated models. One of the biggest failures is that I think a lot of people have had a tendency to overinterpret the results that they're allowed to conclude from those simple models. What can power laws actually give you? What's a good model of the internet, and so on, right? There's sort of nice toys that occasionally in some papers people pretend are more than that. And so incorporating real data is one of the big things, and more people are doing it, but incorporating data intelligently, right? Good data versus big data. I don't think jumping from the network science bandwagon to the big data bandwagon, which is what people seem to be doing, is actually the right approach. I think incorporating data into the modeling, that's why I showed that Facebook example, because we incorporate it in a very specific way, is a good thing, that you have both the data side and the modeling side. I think this current move to leave modeling behind is a mistake. One of the other things that I've been involved in, this has been very rich in network science. It also has an old history, but it's really exploded the last couple of years, and I've written a review article on it. It's a different topic than what I've talked about today. It's called multi-layer networks. So there's two basic types. This includes actually time-dependent networks within its confines, or most of time-dependent networks within its confines. People have different types of social connections. So one of the things, I'm going to bring up the Ebola example since it was brought up earlier, because there was an article on CNN about this. People talk about not just the epidemic of the disease, but the epidemic of being scared of the disease, right? People have talked about that. And there's more than one network on which these occur. There is a contact network in which the disease can spread. There is a different network, including ones that don't involve any contact at all, on which the fear can spread, right? So if I were going to study both the spread of the fear and the spread of the disease, I cannot just have one network. I need both of these networks, and I need the states of the nodes on those networks coupled to each other. So this notion of multi-layer networks, which allows you to have more than one type of edge, or which allows you also to have more than one type of node and coupling between different networks, that framework, which ends up generalizing normal graphs. So for those of you who do things in a linear algebraic context, you use adjacency tensors instead of adjacency matrices, and then have to generalize all these matrix objects to tensors, which if you have experience doing it, you know is non-trivial. But that's one of the big moves, right? Trying to have structures that allow us to throw away less information, because we already know if we throw away time dependence, even though I've done that, you can get misleading information. That's why I was talking about a separation of timescales. There's a hope that you have this separation so that maybe it's okay to do this. If you throw away different types of social ties, you can also get misleading behavior, right? If I'm going to study the fear of Ebola as an epidemic, also with Ebola as an epidemic, I have to keep both types of networks, and the spreads occur on different types, right? It's absolutely essential if I'm going to even broach that problem. And I think, given the stuff we see in the news, I think that problem should also be broached in addition to just the disease spread. So those more general structures that allow you to throw away less information and trying to figure out the right way to generalize things, that's one of the. I mean, I have a vested interest in this. I've written a review article, but I think that's one of the directions that really is up and coming. So, I mean, I don't know what companies are doing. I have different students I actually have some students who are funded by HSBC. So some students are working on similar types of things. The stuff we've done with them so far has more involved correlations of stocks, which uses these techniques, but is a different question than what you're asking. The other one that people have gotten involved in, including with models that are simplistic, like the early ones that I showed you, has to do with systemic risk. If I imagine a bank failing, right, so going from 0 to 1 is now a bank failing, and to try to see how that propagates. But most of those models do not have internal dynamics of the banks themselves, like from a stochastic differential equation. I actually currently have a student who's working on that, but not with the more complicated models that have some of the finance in it. I know that people believe that the social networks matter. Another student of mine has looked at limit order books where it just says, here's the network of people I'm allowed to talk to. So it's not a network of beliefs, but it's a network of whom I'm allowed to trade with, right? So I think the finance people should be doing it, and I know some of them are thinking about it. I don't know an example of that particular question, but I mean, the thing with networks, and this is one of the reasons why this is something that will pervade and not be a fad, is that it's very fundamental that a lot of things really do have that structure. Right? And the idea is that you try to get away from just saying that everybody is connected to everyone else, or at least you figure out when it's okay to do that. Right? There are sometimes, I've already shown examples of sometimes when it's okay to do that, and try to incorporate it when you can, and develop techniques that allow you to just, how does structure affect dynamics? Whether the structure is defined based on who believes whom, or whether it's defined based on which banks are lending to whom, or who's in touch with whom. If you remind me, I can ask my collaborators at HSBC about that particular question. The other thing is, if you're not in a company, you don't know exactly what the company is doing, right? They could be doing all sorts of this stuff, but it's not in the public domain. You mean like combining the data with IMDb, for instance? Yeah, people have short memories for controversy. Right. So in principle, one could study this, and I would view that more as coupling this type of dynamics, roughly speaking, maybe not the exact same mechanism, to the price, right? Because you're actually talking about a social influence much along the lines of what we have here. But yeah, so that I've never seen someone try to do it. But I mean, intuitively, it's a sensible thing to try. Yeah, I agree, it's not possible. Well, yeah. So what you can do, you can report an average. You can report. But the thing is, think of it like with the weather, right? So you can imagine doing a version of a weather report. I mean, I'm not recommending that we do this because this would be probably get many people mad at us. But you can imagine a version of a weather report. How does a weather report work? And of course, it's gotten better over the years. You have an initial condition. I make my observations from yesterday or from today. It might not be perfect. I have some model, or maybe a set of different models, and I have some belief in those models. They're not correct, but they incorporate some physics and so on, right? Whatever level of complexity I want. I run them over ensembles of things, right? Because there's some stochasticity involved, whether it's with ensembles of initial conditions or whatnot. And I run this entire ensemble. And say I run 5,000 of them, and 4,000 of those 5,000 simulations give me rain. That's what it means to have an 80% chance of rain, right? It's from ensembles and saying what fraction. So I can say, in 3 out of the 500 simulations, every single person got infected, right? And I can turn that into a weather prediction. However, I mean, given how long people, I would not want to be reporting those numbers, right? I'm going to get people very mad at me. Well, you try to do, well, but well, it's just like predicting the weather. It's still predicting. I mean, these are probabilistic predictions. You know, if I say there's a 90% chance of rain based on these simulations versus 50%, that's a difference, right? I can't promise it's going to rain, but that's a difference. Maybe I have some situations that almost never lead to an epidemic. Maybe I have other situations that always do. Right? Then you start saying, okay, if I do this vaccination strategy, I reduce my likelihood of an infection from 90% to 50%. So it gives you a reason to do it. That's still predictive. It's just not deterministic. If they're expecting determinism, it's not going to happen. I mean, you know, it would be wonderful, but you know, but prediction and deterministic prediction are not the same thing. No. But the thing is, if you put in a vaccination strategy, you want to say this vaccination strategy is more likely to be better than this other one, right? But the way you would define more likely, given a time scale, is to say this one leads to 50% getting infected in my simulations if I believe whatever models I have, and this one leads to 20. Therefore, I'm going to do the one that leads to 20, you know, subject to the belief in the models and other people doing similar models and getting similar things, so that you have, you know, try to minimize how much concern you have that it's an output of particular choices that you made, the models being wrong, and so on. So it does lead to action. You just cannot be 100% confident about it. And so what you want to do is increase understanding so that you can be better about it. And so that's actually one reason why you want to do the mechanisms. You know, because big data can be a curve fitting, and it can say, okay, I fit curves to known answers, and then tells you nothing about what you should do. And the simple model is something that, you know, you try to get at the mechanisms, and then what you want to do is you want to have simple models that have some element of realism, that have real data, and that the simple models are tested against the more complicated models that might be agent-based or whatnot, because you cannot do the experiment. So the agent-based model is like the experiment, right? That's the best you can do for an experiment in this case. I mean, but there's, you know, I mean, it's a lot of, so you know, you can come up with stuff that says, okay, I have this amount of, you know, like when people also say, okay, you know, 90% of people with this type of cancer detected at this point live within 2 years, it's because you have empirical data that maybe you had 10 people and 9 of them lived that long. That's where that number comes from. It's not that 90% is any magic number, it's an empirical estimate. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I'm not the one making the decisions. You know, because that's much harder. That's much harder than doing some of these scientific things. Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, okay, now what I'm going to say is pie in the sky, but I would love a world in which the politician could be honest about that, because I think people understanding that would be a good thing in terms of trusting what science can and cannot do, right? It would be useful, but yes, you're right, a politician can't do that. But I wish we were in a world where a politician could say, you know, this is what this number actually means. Right, but yeah, we're not. No, I don't expect to be in that world anytime soon. Or I mean, I've lived in that world twice. One's called Caltech and one's called Oxford. But